Okay, so let's just repeat that again. I've come to my God and my sister, my bride, which is the discourse or the conversation between the soul and God. It's part of the conversation between the soul and God. In other words, it's part of the conversation where part of the dialogue where we are really instructed in how to foster this relationship of the love of a bride and bridegroom for each other. I think we could point out by way of it, I'm kind of doing it tongue in cheek a little bit, but at the beginning of the relationship, things are generally much more, after you've been married for a few years, things are not necessarily, they get a bit jaded and maybe not as fresh and not as, that's why he uses the analogy of a bride and a groom, because it's a fresh relationship and it's new and it's exciting and so on. Okay. In any event, I've come to my garden, my sister, my bride. When did he come to the garden? So we began to explain that there were 7 generations, starting with Adam, who pushed away the divine presence from its abode in the physical plane. In other words, the physical plane became estranged from God, you could say. Not completely divorced, but certainly estranged. Then along came 7 generations, starting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so on, and they brought down the divine presence once again to this world. In other words, they brought the divine presence into relationship with the individual once again in this world, until along came Moses, and Moses was the 7th generation, and he brought the Shekhinah back, the divine presence back down to even the physical plane. Now, this was enshrined, this whole relationship was really enshrined in the temple or in the tabernacle. Tabernacle and temple are more or less equivalent. Subsequent to the temple being built, the divine service that we were supposed to be involved in was actually the task of refining and uplifting the sparks of holiness that are buried within creation. They were buried in creation through the sins of those 7 generations. And what we are doing what we were doing with the sacrifices in the temple, the sacrifices, the offerings, was elevating those sparks back to a higher level until eventually the entire world will be restored as a divine place, a place of divinity, a proper place for the divine presence. So we discussed that a little bit, and that was the concept of offering sacrifices. He then goes on to explain that a person might have a question, well, how do I approach God after all is said and done? This is not an easy thing to do. So he explained that it is not easy, but it's certainly possible, and everything depends on you. And that's why it says that the offering was brought. The way the expression is kind of unusual. From you an offering shall be brought. That's what the verse says. It should have said, bring the offering from your possessions, from something that you own. You're not allowed to bring from stolen property. It has to be yours. Okay, that's a simple, straightforward explanation. But the explanation that he was giving, and the one that's favored in Midrash and Kabbalah, is that the offering has to be of you yourself. You have to offer something. The offering has to be from you. But once the offering is from you, you can bring yourself close to God. And it's not dependent on God's capacities, but on yours. So let me share a screen here, and we will be able to see where we are up to. Okay. So we're really up to here, but I just want to reiterate over here. God does not confront his creatures with unfair demands, but bestows his revelation and his light upon each individual according to his capacity. And capacity here is actually not really the best translation. Not only according to his capacity, but according to the person's striving to make that relationship happen. It's not just capacity. Capacity is kind of a passive thing. We're not talking about passive. We're talking about active striving to make a relationship. And he continues, in the words of the Midrash Rabbah, when I make demands upon them, I do not demand according to my capacity, but according to theirs, according to each individual's personal potential. And again, it's not the potential that makes the relationship. A potential only defines what the relationship could be, but it's the striving to achieve it that actually makes the thing happen. And therefore, hence, no hindrances can prevent one from rising to attain a closeness to God. There's nothing that can prevent you from getting there. Yes, there are barriers in the way, but those barriers are largely mirages. One of the midrashim, for example, again, midrashim is rabbinic literature, when Abraham was going to fulfill the will of God, ostensibly to offer up Isaac as an offering. That's what he was told. He was told with those words. He understood it simply that he ought to offer, and he went on his way to offer his son, his only child, Isaac, his only child with Sarah. He was on his way to offer him up. Of course, that wasn't the intention. The intention was when it said "Ha'alehu," means to raise him up to a higher place, but not to offer him up as a sacrifice. But of course, this was a test. It was a test for Abraham. But there were other aspects of the test as well. That on his way, on the way, there was a barrier. There was a hindrance, and that hindrance was like this huge sea, apparently, which he wasn't aware of, this huge sea which he couldn't circumvent. So he said to himself, this is what the Medrash tells us, he said to himself, look, God told me that I have to go straight to Har Moriah. I have to go to this Mount Moriah. And if that's what God told me, I'm going straight. I'm not going to go all the way around. I'm going to go the shortest possible route. And so he stepped into this apparent sea, but it turned out it was a mirage. It was a mirage. It wasn't really there. It was a test. It was another aspect of the test, and so on and so forth. And there's several other examples that are brought of the tests that Abraham faced when he was on his way to Mount Moriah, Har Moriah. And the same thing is true of all of us. When we decide on a goal and we sort of latch onto that goal, and this is what I have to do, and this is what I must do, and this is what I want to do, and you gear yourself up for the whole thing, and feel a certain level of commitment and a certain level of responsibility to see it through, and all of a sudden this barrier crops up and that barrier crops up, and maybe you shouldn't do it, maybe it's not the right thing, maybe it's not the right time, maybe I'm not the right person. Maybe it's a different way, and so on and so forth. And all these barriers, there may indeed be wise advice not to go that way. But the way to do things is to ask advice and then proceed. And if barriers then present themselves in the way of between you and your goal, the way to do it is to overcome the barriers and not turn back in defeat. There was the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose name was Rabbi Shmuel, and better known as the Maharash, Rabbi Shmuel. So he was known to have an expression that he said like this: Lechatchila ariber. From the outset, you go over the top. In other words, don't try and skirt the issue. Don't duck until the situation changes, until things change, until the situation improves or whatever it is. That's not the way to go. The way to go is lechatchila ariba. You go over the top, right? Over the top. Don't go around, don't go underneath, don't duck your head. You just go over the top. If there's a barrier, climb over it. That was his way of doing things. Does it work for everybody? Well, if you practice it like he did, it certainly does. He was a very remarkable person who was, he passed away quite young actually, but due to an illness, but he was a person that achieved many different things. You know, he was a very deep thinker. He was, everything he did very quickly and very managed to accomplish things with incredible speed. He was proficient in several languages, like at least 5 languages. He was fluent in 5 languages. He traded for, he never accepted donations from anybody because he traded stocks, and he did very well trading stocks for himself. He was quite a character. He's quite an interesting person. Anyway, why am I digressing? All right, so the only thing that can prevent you from doing what you're supposed to be doing is yourself, by taking heed of barriers that are not really barriers, they're just mirages. Yeah. Okay, let's continue. The first lesson then is that the verse about sacrifices teaches a man. And again, when he says a man here, it's just a bad translation. It says a man is meant in a generic sense, a person. It's not the greatest translation, but anyway, whatever it is, it is. So then the sacrifice teach a person who seeks to draw near to God is that the capacity to do so is mikem, it's from you. It's dependent on you, yourself alone. That's where it is. Yes, that's correct. Yeah, correct. The sacrificial object to be offered, so you have to bring the sacrifice from you. But the sacrificial object to be offered is not only an actual animal. Of course, there was the animal that they brought in the time of the sacrifices. But that wasn't the only thing. There had to be a certain meditation when you brought the animal. It wasn't that you sort of just, so to speak, sent God a coupon for a steak, that kind of thing. That wasn't the intention. The intention was that you'd really feel it. You should identify with that thing, that you're giving up something of yourself. It's not just, a piece of meat on the barbecue, kind of thing. That's not the idea, obviously. So, the sacrificial object they offered is not only an actual animal, rather, as the 3 words of our verse teach, mikem korban lashem, from you there shall be a sacrifice to God from you. In other words, the object that needs to be sacrificed is the animal within a person's heart, his animal soul. Now, this is a fundamental teaching in Judaism, but it's really emphasized very much in Chabad Hasidus. Chabad Hasidus, Lubavitch Chabad, the Hasidic discipline, which the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was the last Rebbe of, for the meanwhile, until Mashiach comes. In any event, the idea is emphasized very much in the seminal book of Hasidus, of Chabad Hasidus, and that is the book of Tanya, where it speaks in the first few chapters. It speaks about the animal soul within a person. So, in other words, a person has a human soul, but he also has an animal soul. He has a godly soul, rather, let's not call it human, but a godly soul. He has a godly soul, he has an animal soul, both of them living within him. In other words, 2 sources of motivation. One source of motivation is to satisfy yourself, to feel comfortable, to have a steak and chips, check a steak and fries or whatever, with a beer probably. And that's what makes you feel good, makes you feel comfortable, with maybe some chocolate on the side. And all very well and good, but that's the animal soul. What are you doing for your godly soul? So there's very often, and with most people constantly, a struggle between these 2 sides of the human personality, between these 2 sides of the human being. the godly side and the animal side. And of course, the animal side is a very useful side to have because, as we'll see later, um, there is much that can be produced with the power of an ox, as it says. Rav Tvu is b'koach shori. There's a lot of produce in the power of an ox. We'll see that later on. So if a person can harness his animal soul, let's not say subdue, but can harness his animal soul in the proper way, then that's the most productive situation that could be. Because the godly soul without the animal soul doesn't have much of an effect. And the animal soul without the godly soul is a wild animal. But if the godly soul can harness the animal soul together, they can work on improving the world, on doing the right thing, on moving upwards, and so on and so forth. That's the ideal situation. So let's continue. After stating in general terms that the offering to God is to be brought of cattle, the verse proceeds to enumerate the detailed categories of animal that need to be sacrificed. The three kinds of sacrifice of animals, which are cows or oxen, actually, bulls, cows, sheep, and goats, and also birds, but birds are not really animals, they're birds. Okay, so the verse continues and proceeds to enumerate the detailed categories of animal that need to be sacrificed. Of the herd and of the flock shall you bring your offering. The herd would be cows and bulls, and the flock would be more goats and sheep. For every man, every person has his own distinctive task of self-refinement. Some people are like the oxen, and some people are more like the sheep or the goat. Now, each of these animals has their personality. The ox an ox has a fiery temper, but it's very powerful. A sheep is very meek and mild, and that's its negative quality. That it's always bleating, so to speak. It doesn't get anything done. And the goat is the concept in what's called in Hebrew chutzpah, right? It's got real chutzpah. It has what's the word for chutzpah? Chutzpah. I don't know, cheek. How would you say chutzpah? How would you say chutzpah in English? Probably everybody knows what chutzpah is, yeah? Chutzpah, yes. Spunk is not really, no, chutzpah and spunk is not really, spunk is more courage. But this is cheeky courage, you could say, yeah? It's like very cheeky and well, brazen, I think that's the word, yeah, there you go, brazenness. So the goat represents sort of the idea of brazenness. Okay, so everyone has their distinctive task of self-refinement. Nerve, yeah, there you go. One man, 1 second, is one of the animals that can be sacrificed better than the other, or are they about the same in value? It depends. It depends. It depends on what the sacrifice was. The sacrifice was usually specified as to what kind of animal they had to be for the different kinds of sacrifices. But if it was an offering that was a sort of, how shall I say, a free offering, an offering that you brought of your own free will, you weren't obligated therein, then you could bring anything. Goal, yeah. There you go. Goal, yeah, that's another word for it, right? So nerve or goal or chutzpah. Okay. One person has to sacrifice an animal nature that is as gross as a goring ox. I don't like the word gross there either, but anyway, okay. Another has to cope with an animal nature that resembles a sheep. Meek, mild, docile, as they say around here. And the meekness and mildness is not necessarily exclusively a good quality. Meek and mild people are usually followers. They're not leaders, and one needs a leader. One needs to be a leader in your own house, in your own family, in your own community, and so on. Okay. So the verse closes on the same lines. Takrive es korbanchem. You, plural, shall bring your offering. For each individual has his unique challenge of self-refinement. So what's the offering? The offering is from you. In other words, it's an aspect of self-refinement that is relevant to you as a person, depending on what your personality is. When the offering of an actual animal was brought in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple, it was sacrificed on the altar. The Talmud in Yoma, that's one of the tractates of the Talmud, relates that it was consumed, the korban, the offering, was consumed by a divine fire that crouched there like a lion. When it crouched there like a lion, in other words, when the divine fire came down and consumed the offering, the sacrifice, it looked like a crouching lion. That's what it means. Rashi explains that a fiery coal fell from heaven. It wasn't a coal, that's not the right word. It was just a bolt of fire kind of that fell from heaven during the time of Solomon. So to the Zohar speaks of a lion that would consume the sacrifices. But again, it only looked like it. It wasn't actually a lion that consumed the sacrifices, obviously. It was fire, heavenly fire. So this heavenly fire has its counterpart in the divine service that takes place within each person. This is the flame that flares in his divine soul. So in other words, when the flame and the fire, that bolt of fire came from heavens, consumed the sacrifice, what's that in us? That is the passion, the heavenly fire, the passion to do what it is that we're supposed to do and that God wants us to do. That's the passion, the flame in the person's divine soul. Okay. This is alluded to in Shir HaShirim, in the Song of Songs. It's coals, and again, this is a bad translation. It's not that, it shouldn't be translated as coal, but the tongues of fire, or the burst of fire, flashing fire, flash of fire. It's coals, the coals of fire. Coals is not the right word. The flame of God. That's the original Hebrew. Reshafer means like the tongues of fire. Okay, so it's the flame of God. So Midrash Rabbah, cited in Yalkut, likens this fire to fire from heaven. It does not consume water, nor is it quenched by water. It's not quenched by water. Elisha, I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean you're not hearing my voice, or do you mean something else? Like the burning bush. Yes. Like the burning bush. It's not fire that can be quenched by water. It's not fire that consumes. It's not necessarily fire that consumes that which the fire is found in, as it was in the burning bush, but in this case, it does consume the sacrifice. It burns it up. Okay, similarly. But what do we mean over here? Similarly, the fiery love of God in the divine soul of a Jew, of a person, cannot be quenched. It has to first be aroused. You have to get the heart on fire first, right? It doesn't go on fire by itself. It could be, depending on the individual, it could be that his heart is like a block of ice. He's not warmed up to it at all, and therefore you have to spend some time, igniting the fire first. But once the fire of God burns in the divine soul, it cannot be quenched. It's always there, but it's sometimes very hidden, and therefore it has to be fanned into a real fire. This is alluded to in the next verse in Shir HaShirim. Great waters cannot quench the love, nor can rivers drown it. Okay, as we said, it's always there. It's something that's inherent in the divine soul. This love for God is inherent in the divine soul, and it has to be brought into revelation. It's there, but it has to be brought into revelation. Okay. The turbulent waters, what are the turbulent waters that cannot extinguish this fire? The turbulent waters are the worries that a person has, a person's worries. Primarily the worries of making a living, and other confusing disturbances that distract the person from his divine service, from the study of Torah and the observance of mitzvot or mitzvahs. So that's called the waters of Noah's flood, right? That's the waters of Noah's flood, with the worries and the concern with this world, which was overblown and overdone. These are called the waters that attempt to extinguish the flame of the divine soul, but cannot do so. Despite all these disturbances, rivers of water cannot drown this fiery love of God, for it resembles a heavenly fire that nothing can extinguish. Okay, straightforward enough. Just as the physical offering was consumed by the divine fire on the altar, similarly in the personal sphere, the offering, which is each individual's animal soul, has to be consumed by his personal divine fire. In this way, the animal soul too will be taught to develop a love for God. Correct. The animal soul will be taught to develop a love for God. But it has to be, you have to put the right kind of fuel on the fire. Yeah, these times are trying. Depends how you look at it, you know. Everything depends on your mindset, I think. Yeah, they're trying. You know, it's not, things are not easy necessarily. And that's just the way life is right now. But that too is a test. That too is one of the barriers that needs to be overcome. All right. So this is hinted to in the words in the wording of a phrase from the Shema. The Shema is one of the central prayers of Jewish practice. The Shema prayer. No, it's not just the central prayer, a central prayer. It is really the central prayer. It's not only a prayer, it's like a declaration of allegiance, the Pledge of Allegiance. This is hinted to in the wording of a phrase from Shema: you shall love the Lord with your God with all your heart. B'chol levavecha. The word used for heart here is not libcha, but levavecha. In the Hebrew, let me see here. I think I can. Let me just get a drawing board, a whiteboard. Here we go. All right. Okay, so the word lavavecha in Hebrew. Again, I'm drawing with a mouse over here, so it's not great. Lavavecha would be the way you write it in Hebrew. So you see that these are two identical letters. Yeah, and it should have been, we would think that it should have just said libecha, b'chol levcha or libecha, right? But it doesn't say that. It says with two of them. So why does it say two? Why does it hint at these two things? So the word bet in Hebrew is basically the same letter as the word bayit, because you house two things, right? You have two houses within you, so to speak. You house the godly soul and you house the animal soul. And therefore, within one person, you have contradictions and you have sometimes battles with yourself. And sometimes not just battles, but wars, which can be rather unpleasant. We must admit, it can be very unpleasant. But that is the reality. That's what we have to deal with. And that's why the verse says, B'chol levavecha, with both of your hearts. Not one heart, but your both hearts. The doubling of the middle letter suggests a plural form and is thus interpreted by the Talmud to mean that a person is commanded to love God with all of your dual heart. In other words, with both sides of your heart, with both of your desires. Excuse me, so that the animal soul too will love divinity. The animal soul has to come to a love of God as well. Now, how do you achieve this? He explains. This comes about through the enclosement of the divine soul within the animal soul. If the animal soul would just be an animal soul and left to its own devices, so what would it do? It would do what most cows do. It would spend most of its time eating, right? That's what it would do. We probably do that anyway, but hopefully we at least take some part of the day and try and make it a little bit holy. Prayers every day, study of some sort of scripture and writings of the rabbis and teachings and so on and so forth. That's the divine soul attempting to harness, or if not harness, at least limit the activities of the animal soul. Okay. But initially, the animal soul has no knowledge of divinity, nor any sensitivity for it whatever. It simply doesn't. I'm sure if any of you have watched a cow, for example, or a bull, they don't sort of sit down and put their hands up like this and start thinking about divine matters. It's simply looking for the next, either looking for something to drink or for where the next grass is going to be. Lunch or dinner, or whatever it is. So animals don't think beyond their current preoccupation with eating. And that's what our nefesh bahamas, our animal soul, would do if it was left to its own devices without the godly soul. Okay, so let's see something in the chat here. 1 second. We all have our weaknesses. Okay, so nevertheless, when the godly soul, which is enclosed in the animal soul, meditates on spiritual concepts in a manner in which the animal soul can also comprehend, the animal soul also draws nearer to them. It's one of the fundamental concepts over here, not to meditate on things which are so far outside of the realm of your animal soul that it has no relevance to it at all, and therefore doesn't get rectified thereby. One has to try and understand. As explained elsewhere, a pervasive impression is thereby made upon it that divinity is comprehensible, which divinity is comprehensible to a certain extent, obviously not to the fullest extent. Okay. This continues to the point that the animal soul is transformed from its bestiality. It is elevated and consumed by the fiery coals of the divine soul's yearning for God. In other words, that yearning for God is really what ignites the passion and the desire to get close, the desire to lift oneself up beyond just the animalistic level and become human, and therefore in some kind of relationship with the divine, with God. So just as an animal offered in the Beit HaMikdash in the temple was consumed by fire on the altar, so too, contemplating the ideas that we mentioned, the soul becomes consumed by the fiery coals of the divine, by the fiery flames of the divine encounter. This is the sublimation spoken of in the verse. There are many harvests in the strength of an ox. As you said before, there are many crops in the strength of an ox. And in other words, we can use the strength of the ox, the animal soul, to move us forward. We can harness that energy. I man can harness the power of his animal soul to the service of God. And that's really the fundamental first step approach, to, I was up at 4 this morning. The fundamental approach to godliness is to harness the power of the animal soul in our divine service. Okay, let's continue. Sit back, or supposed to do something. No, you're definitely supposed to do something. Prayer, of course, and then there is the self-refinement, and there's reaching out to others and helping others, and then there is obviously reaching out to God and trying to become more knowledgeable in godly matters, and so on. How's the animal soul related to the ego? I think you could say that the animal soul is the ego, but the ego is not necessarily an arrogant ego. It depends on what kind of animal soul one has. But animal soul is your sense of self, right? Your real sense of self should be your godly soul, but practically speaking, our animal souls are our sense of self. That has to be refined and elevated, so that the ego is no longer ego. It's just, I suppose you could say, if you just drop the e, it would be go. It's energy, it's enthusiasm, and so on. It's the go in us. So the offering of a physical sacrifice caused the godly sparks invested within the mineral, vegetable, and animal components of the world to be refined and elevated. As we said before, that the sparks of holiness that are embedded within creation need to be refined, elevated, and restored to their proper place. Similarly, the offering of a spiritual sacrifice within oneself refines and elevates the animal soul and transforms its darkness into light. Now, this whole concept of transforming the darkness into light is a fundamental concept in the Zohar, and became part of, because of the Zohar, became like a very fundamental goal in Jewish mysticism, to transform darkness into light and bitterness into sweetness. Now, there's a lot of ways in which this is done and can be done and so on, but he will explain some of them as we continue through the various coming chapters. In any event, in this manner, they shall make me a sanctuary, and I shall dwell within them, within each individual. I will dwell within each individual. If you have your sanctuary and you make sure to treat it as a sanctuary, and you make sure to invite God into your sanctuary, then for sure I will dwell within them. This is accomplished through a person's divine service, the service of subordinating his or her animal nature, and not just subordinating it, but as we said before, using it in the right way, particularly in a manner that leads to its transformation. In a manner that leads to its transformation. And there are actually a number of works that speak about this whole concept of what's called ishapcha. There are two concepts in the Zohar that are of very great importance in terms of a person's divine service. One is called iskafia, self-subjugation, and the other is called ishapcha, self-transformation. And transformation is the higher aspect and the one that we should be aiming at. In the meanwhile, at least self-control, self-subjugation is the first step, but then we eventually come to the concept of transformation and sublimation. Sublimation means elevating the thing up to a much holier, elevating even the human body up to a much higher level. But then, as the Zohar states, when the Sitra Achra is subdued, when the other side, the Sitra Achra, the side of unholiness, is subdued, the glory of God rises thereby and is diffused throughout all of the worlds. When the side of unholiness, when unholiness is subdued, in other words, it comes under the control of the holy within us, then the glory of God rises thereby, it's revealed thereby, and is diffused throughout all of the worlds. This refers to the revelation of the transcendent light, which is called Sovev Ka'olmen. If you remember, we started speaking about that when we spoke about Keter. When we spoke about, in the beginning, we spoke about how there is the possibility of transforming the sacrifices into a flame for God, right? And similarly, this is the idea, when the Sitra Achra is subdued, when then the glory of God appears. When the sacrifice is offered up, then the glory of God comes down, so to speak, and consumes it. Okay, so that refers to the revelation of the transcendent light, which is called Sovev Ka'olmen, the light which transcends all of the worlds and is brought back down. That's the divine presence that's brought back into the world, but not in a way of enclosement, but rather in the way of everything is included within it. It merges into the essence. Okay, summary. This chapter explains the parallels between the offering of a sacrifice in the Beit HaMikdash and the temple and an individual's divine service or of self-refinement. It emphasizes that drawing near to God depends on one sacrificing something from within himself or herself. It discusses the fire from above, i.e. the way in which the godly soul, enclosed as it is within the animal soul in all of us, teaches it to share in its love of God. Yeah, the godly soul teaches the animal soul to also appreciate and to come to love godliness. Okay. Any other questions? That our place in this world can happen, that can happen to each of us. Yeah, it can happen, sure. Any other questions, folks? Thank you. What happened in society world spiritually when evil is greater than goodness? Well, you can have something like the flood, but God promised that he won't do such a thing again. I don't know. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so that's my default mic. That's what it's supposed to be. Okay, I don't know. Windows is doing its thing, you know. So that to answer that question, yeah. Yeah, define evil, huh? It's not so easy to define. Okay, so I once read an essay. It was a very sort of irreverent essay, but kind of funny. God calls the angel Gabriel, and he says, Gabriel, the earth has become full of evil and so on and so forth. How about a flood? So Gabriel says to him, I mean, again, this is humor. Don't take it seriously. Gabriel says to God, well, you know, you promised that that you wouldn't bring another flood on the earth. So he says, okay, what about how about a fire, right? So so they said, well, you know, they have these fire trucks and this and that, and you know, equipment and fireproof safety rooms and so on. It's not going to be so easy. So well, what about an illness? Well, they have vaccines and they have and so it goes on, and God keeps on suggesting various things, and and Gabriel, the angel, just says, you know, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. The other thing's not going to work. Whatever. Until eventually he says, God says to Gabriel, Gabriel, bring me your harp and play me the blues. Okay, only a joke. Don't take it seriously. Lighten things up a little bit. The idea is this. God does not allow the situation to occur where evil will overcome the world to such an extent anymore. That happened. It certainly happened in the time of Noah, but it will not happen again. The various things happen that awaken within us certain spiritual longings and perhaps new beginnings, you might say. I think I think that there may be some people who look at the coronavirus that way. Yes, you had to stay home for a certain amount of time, and you had to. So that was useful, or it could have been useful at least in terms of. Instead of rushing out, now you had time to recede within or travel within and spend a bit of time with yourself. Yes, with your family as well, obviously, and with your friends, but you know, a lot of time contemplating and thinking and hopefully resetting. Yeah, you know, hitting the reset button, and hopefully things will return to normal. but normal in a positive way. In other words, much better than they were. Okay. Okay, folks, I think we're going to call it a day. If there's anything else, again, this will be up on the channel, the YouTube channel, which is called Kabbalah Decoded. I saw that there's somebody else who started another Kabbalah Decoded channel. Just make sure you go to this one if that's what you're looking for. There's one by some guy named Rodney something or other, I don't know. But all right. Folks, have a great weekend. See you all, and we will be in touch next week. All right. Bye now.